At this time, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, the Honorable John K. Dietz. Recently retired, Judge Dietz served as judge of the Texas Judicial District 250 from 1991 to 2014, when his current term expired. He received 3 degrees from the University of Texas. His bachelor and master's degrees in psychology, and in 1977, his Juris Doctorate from the UT Law School. Following graduation, Judge Dietz served as an administrative assistant to Texas Attorney General John Hill, an administrative assistant to State Senator Lloyd Doggett, a prosecutor with the Special Crimes Division of the Travis County District Attorney's Office, and a private practitioner of law. On February 4th, 2014, Judge Dietz ruled that Texas public school funding system is unfair, inefficient, and unconstitutional. The lawsuit set a record as the largest school finance case in Texas. 600 school districts representing 3/4 of the state's students were involved in this suit against the Texas Education Agency. Judge Dietz presided over the trial that began October 2012 and lasted a total of 67 days and included 250,000 pages of exhibits. There have been 6 comparable court cases since 1984. In 2004, Judge Dietz issued a similar school finance ruling in the West Orange Cove 2 case, directing the legislature to change the school funding system. We are truly honored to have with us today such a distinguished judicial leader who has been instrumental in working to ensure that our state's public education needs are met. Please welcome the Honorable John Dietz.
Thank you. So when I first ran for election 25 years ago, I learned never to stand by anything that was as tall as I was. Normally, I would be on the floor, but when I got here, I didn't realize that this room was about 2 blocks long. So if I don't walk off the stage, it'll be a miracle. I thought that what we would do is to try to go behind the headlines, and here we go. Go behind the headlines about Judge Dietz rules the school finance system unconstitutional, and explore a little bit the legal concepts and a little bit of the history, both of the section that you're looking at and of Texas education. And then, if this were reality TV, I have 3 slides that I want to show you that I believe sort of encapsulate the difficulty with school finance today. So one of the things that when people say it's unconstitutional, by the way, did anybody here read my 404-page opinion? I take that as a no. All right. So it's the first thing that you realize, you look here at Article 7, Section 1 of the 1876 Texas Constitution, and you start off in the first clause with some rather strange language, a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the liberties and the rights of the citizens, of the people, it shall be the duty, and then they go into the second clause and they start talking about the duty of the legislature. And they impose on the legislature a duty to establish a suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. So where did all of this come from? With your permission, I'm going to take you on a small history lesson. It is 1779. We're in Virginia, and what's going on? Well, for one thing, they're trying to rebel against King George. That's going on. But in Virginia, it had been a while since they had attended to their laws, and they wanted to redraft their laws. So they turned to the smartest fellow in the room, Thomas Jefferson, and they said, "Thomas, would you be so kind as to redraft our laws?" And Thomas said, "I'd be happy to." And they said, "By the way, Thomas, would you also draft a provision for free public schools?" And Thomas did that. And the bill that he wrote was called a Bill for the Provision of a General Diffusion of Knowledge. Now, what made it remarkable is that in Section 1 of this bill, Thomas Jefferson laid out his argument for free public schools. And he said, first, we are self-governing, or we at least hope to be if we can get rid of this George fellow. We're self-governing. And unlike monarchies and other types of things, we govern ourselves, but it requires the people who lead us are sometimes ambitious. And you know how ambitious people are. They become tyrants. And the best defense against tyranny and having ambition turn into tyranny is if all of our people are educated and know about ambition at different times and different places throughout our history. The second thing he said, if we're self-governing, doesn't it make sense that we not rely solely upon the rich and the privileged to lead us? Doesn't it make sense that we have a meritocracy and get the best people, the smartest people, to draft our laws and to administer our laws? And those people are not always among the rich and the privileged. Poor people have smart people. And we should educate all of the smart people because we, as a self-governing free society, will benefit. The third argument he makes, it's going to cost a lot of money to do this. And we're going to have to tax everybody in order to get a system of free public schools. And people are not going to be too happy about that. But ask yourself, isn't it better to pay the tax than to live under a tyranny? And I think if you had asked people in Nazi Germany or in Cambodia or at any time throughout our history, would you pay a small tax not to be subjected to this tyrant? People would be happy to pay it. Well, what was interesting is that even in that day, when we didn't have an internet, publishing was not all of that widespread. That notion, those three arguments that Thomas Jefferson made, were very powerful and they spread. Okay, so I want to move up to March the 2nd, 1836. We're near Navasota at Washington on the Brazos. Here's a group of really, really angry men. And they're going, we want to separate and rebel against Mexico. What do you think? Yeah, that sounds great. Well, let's do what Thomas Jefferson did. Remember how he wrote the Declaration of Independence? Yeah. Well, let's write a Declaration of Independence from the government of Mexico. So they get set about writing the Texas Declaration of Independence. Somewhere about number 8, number 9, somebody speaks up and they say, you know one thing that I really, really don't like? I don't like how they'll just come in the middle of the night, arrest you, and throw you in a jail cell. And they won't even tell you what you're charged with. Yeah, that's good. Put that down. Then somebody says, yeah, you know another thing? When they throw you in the jail cell, they won't even give you a right to a trial by jury. Oh, that's good. Put that down. And the very next thing, after the jury trial, the complaint about the jury trial, is this remarkable statement. You know, Mexico has abundant resources, and they have not even provided a system of free public schools. Oh, that's great. Put that down. So we rebel. We become a republic. 9 years later, 1845, the United States is about to annex Texas. And the Washington says to Texas, you know, you're not going to be a republic anymore. Maybe you need to draft a new constitution. And they go, don't. And they draft the Constitution of 1845. And smack dab in the middle of that Constitution is this clause. Now, it's a little mysterious who wrote it, but essentially what he was doing is what typical drafters of constitutions do from the Enlightenment. They put first a general statement of principles. And the principle here is that a general diffusion of knowledge is essential for our liberties and our rights. And then they go in and tell you what the process is going to be. So, carrying back to the history, a little bit later, 1850. So they draft this in 1845. Did they establish free public schools? Because it says there's a duty, and the answer is no, because they didn't put any provision in the 1845 Constitution for taxation, and there was no way to pay for public schools. So in 1854, y'all have seen these maps of Texas where they have the north part up in near Dalhart, and it extends on into New Mexico and into Colorado. Y'all seen that? Okay. Well, it turns out that in the Compromise of 1850, the United States asked Texas to waive its claim to all of that territory. And Texas agreed, and the United States paid Texas $20 million. They gave the legislature $20 million, and the legislature said, okay, well, maybe now we can start the public free schools. But they were terrible. And it suffered that way throughout. And by 1861, we were voting to withdraw from the Union. 1865, we've lost the war between the states. And we're now under the radical Reconstructionist government that comes into Texas. We're withdrawn from the Union, and Thaddeus Stevens, played by Tommy Lee Jones, they come in and they run Texas. And they are centrist. They arrest people during the night. They tax a lot, and everybody just hates them. By 1870, Texas is now reconstructed and ready to be admitted back into the Union, and we start defeating the radical Republicans, and the Democrats are back in control, and they say, you know what? We need a new Constitution. We need something that will rid our mouth of the taste of these radical Reconstructionists. Let's get a new Constitution. 1875, here in Austin, about within 2 miles of where we're seated, is our last constitutional convention. 90 delegates come. They meet September, October, and they finish their work in November of 1875. The provision that invokes the most controversy is this provision. Well, wait, didn't you tell us that that was in the 1845 Constitution? I did. But they've had a chance to watch it, and it's interesting to show you that there is nothing new in modern times. Here was the opposition, the first opposition. Oh my gosh, we can't be educating children. That's a family activity. You have the judiciary, you have the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, but none of that sounds like education, and we don't want to interfere with family rights. And then there's another group who says, wait a minute, you can't compel all these kids to go to school. That's anti-American. You can't do that. There's a third group who says, you know, we have this wonderful system of private schools, and if the government gets involved in education, they'll be competing against private industry. That would be wrong. And the fourth and most vociferous group said, I don't know about y'all, but my people didn't send me up here to tax. So they debate back and forth, and it is, there's maybe a fist fight or two within the debate. And finally, it passes 55-25, and they put the provision back in the Constitution, adding the word efficient. So, does the legislature start to establish a system of free public schools? And the answer is no, not yet. They didn't put in a provision for taxation because they're scared to. 1883, they finally pass a teeny tiny tax and establish schools. And the schools are terrible. By the turn of the century, after World War I, see if this sounds familiar, the rural school districts are saying, listen, we're not getting enough money out here, and we can't provide the same kind of education all of those big city schools can provide. And the legislature says, oh, we can't give you more money, but would you like free textbooks? That was a joke. All right, you're a tough crowd, I can see this. So, Texas education is sort of pitiful until after World War II. Now we have the baby boom, and it was the pioneering efforts of a state senator from East Texas named Senator Aiken with a representative from West Texas named Gilmer that passes the Gilmer-Aiken Act. And they reestablish the Texas Education Agency, get a statewide supervisor, and get a sustainable method of financing schools. And we've been sailing along since that time with essentially the architecture that was established in 1949 with the Gilmer-Aiken Act. Okay, so that's enough of history. Let me just talk a little bit about this section. The first part, a general diffusion of knowledge, when we talk about it in court, we call it a GDK. And we're talking about, well, is it a GDK? And what the Supreme Court tells courts, trial courts like mine, was that, listen, you really ought not to be holding statutes of the legislature unconstitutional. In fact, Dietz, the first thing that you ought to do is to presume that these statutes are constitutional. And the case law tells me that they've wrestled with is what TEA, through the legislature, through TEA, is what they're requiring, is that a general diffusion of knowledge? And the Supreme Court has said a couple of times, listen, we're going to presume that the required curriculum from PK to 12, the accreditation, we're going to assume that that is a general diffusion of knowledge. Okay, so then you look to the second clause. And suitable means that the legislature has to provide enough money to operate and to maintain the 1,000+ school districts to provide the accredited education. And then efficiency doesn't mean efficiency as you would find it in the dictionary. Efficiency means that children of poverty-poor schools have to receive enough resources that they receive a general diffusion of knowledge, just as the students in poverty-rich districts do. And so it's an equality. So the three standards were, is the legislature suitably providing money to schools so that they can provide a GDK? And my answer was, no, I don't think so. In fact, it's unconstitutional, especially if you look at the fact that the 5 million children that we now have enrolled in Texas schools, 60% of them are economically disadvantaged. And through no fault of their own, they have arrived at school with certain disadvantages that you need to overcome. For one thing, they arrive with much smaller vocabularies. Now, every expert who testified during our 67 days said, look, you can overcome that, but you have to spend about 1.5 times the time with that student. You have to do before-school programs. You have to do after-school programs. You have to do summer programs. And it's going to cost you about 1.5 times what it costs you with a student who's not suffering the disadvantages of poverty. And that testimony was essentially uncontradicted. That's 3 million, 60% of our students are economically disadvantaged. The second thing that it appeared to me was that we now have approximately 900,000 children who are English language learners. 90% of them come from Spanish as their first language. The other 10% come with 120 plus different languages. For some reason, I found this somewhat humorous. I remember the superintendent from Abilene talking about how Abilene was a sanctuary city, that the State Department says that if you bring in political refugees, take them to Abilene. And then I was talking to the superintendent in Amarillo, and he says, we have double the population of Abilene. So the State Department wants you to put them in Abilene and in Amarillo, among other places. Anyway, the superintendent says, oh, these people are from Sudan. They're having a civil war there, you know. And I said, I've heard. And he says, well, he said, I'm having a hell of a time trying to get somebody to come out and teach algebra who speaks Sudanese to Abilene. And I went, you think? So it appeared to me that the legislature, and we'll get into it when I get into the slides coming, wasn't providing the resources to the school districts in this state to cope with the economically disadvantaged and with the English language learners. And there was some really pretty substantial evidence that indicated that. And then efficiency. We have been struggling with efficiency since the 80s. The very first school finance case, Edgewood 1, was tried in the same courtroom that I sat in. And the problem, I hope this is not too flippant, is that we rely so much on local taxation that, that the dirt in Alice, Texas, is not worth the same as the dirt in Dallas, Texas. And if you start from that premise, it gets kind of hard to run a school system of 1,000 plus districts that are efficient, that is, have nearly equal access to revenues to provide a GDK. And it ought not, we have the same constitutional guarantee whether we're in Dalhart or in Brownsville or in Texarkana or El Paso, and it ought not to make a difference as to your zip code, as to your right to receive an adequate education. Let me talk about where I got these slides. There's 3 of them. There is a permanent committee called the Legislative Budget Board, whose bosses are the Texas Senate and the Texas House of Representatives. Now, the purpose of the Legislative Budget Board is to help the legislature put together their budget bills, their appropriation bills. And their employees also, every bill that gets introduced, every piece of proposed legislation that says, we want to do this, they analyze as to the fiscal impact on how much is the revenue, how much is it going to cost, what's the fiscal impact of the proposed legislation. And every 2 years between legislative sessions, they produce a 650-page report called the Fiscal Size Up. So these next 3 slides all come from the Fiscal Size Up. And the reason I chose them is because the first thing is I wanted to show you what the legislature is aware of. Or if they're not aware of, they're not reading their own material. And number 2, I wanted to show something that cannot be attacked for credibility, because this is what the legislature relies upon. So the first thing this shows is that in the year 2011-2012, this came from the National Education Association, Texas ranked 44th in the country in the amount per student, school expenditures per student. Now, I'm going to give you 3 amazing facts about this chart. Here's the first fact. Louisiana, you know, Bossier City, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, whatever the name is of the swamp. They spend more money on per student than does Texas. You go up to Arkansas, Fort Smith, Little Rock, Bentonville. They spend more money per student than does Texas. You go to New Mexico, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, volcanic dust. They spend more money per student than does Texas. Here's the second amazing fact. If you go to the National Education Association and you go to this year's version of this, they revised this number and we slipped to 46th. Here's the third amazing fact. This year, for the school year 2012-2013, we slipped to 47th. And now for the pièce de résistance, the most amazing fact. 1998, everybody pause a minute. Think of where you were 16, 17 years ago. In 1998, we were 24th. Okay, so tell me how, if they're aware of this, how does the legislature justify this? Okay, moving on. All right, now this will be a little bit more difficult. We kind of colored it so it would make come out more vivid. On the left side, it's a bar graph. On the left side are indices, and they're in tens of billions of dollars. So the first line that you see is roughly 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion, 40 billion. And the yellow is the amount that is put in by local school districts, their taxing effort. The blue is the amount that is put in by the state, and the black is the amount that is provided by the federal government. So, looking over to the far left in 2006, I believe, it shows that roughly we spent a total of $38 billion on school children in the state of Texas. Now, you will see a black line at the very top of 2006. So, this is my one and only visual prop. So, in 2006, if you took your tax dollars and you took a tax $1, it would purchase $1 worth of goods. But there's a little teeny tiny bit of inflation. Let's call it about 2%. So by 2007, you take your dollar and it only is able to purchase 98 cents of what the 2006 dollar did. You go, there's 2% inflation, you take a little bit more off, and it's only able in 2008 to purchase 96 cents. So it's a little hard to get the comparables as you go across this graph because inflation keeps changing. The blue dotted line that runs across the top looks almost benign. It proceeds at about, for you geometry teachers, it proceeds at about a 5-degree slope. And what this is the number of students that have the increase in the number of students enrolled in Texas schools. Over this 10-year period, 700,000 students were added to Texas schools, more than any state in the union. Okay, so what? Well, here's the so what. That's about $1 billion worth of increased cost each year. Okay, I'm following you so far, Dietz, but is there an end to this? Well, yes, because if you make this constant dollars with the population increase, you will see that by 2015, we are spending less per student than we did in 2006. What? Yeah, because the politicians all run out and says, yeah, we're spending more money. Yes, but it doesn't compare unless you make it constant dollars, and in order to get it comparable, you're spending less money. So we've drifted from 24th to 47th. In 3 more years, I predict that we will hit dead last. We are now spending less money than we were in 2006. Well, what is the consequence? And here comes my favorite slide, slide number 3. This is the number of students passing all tests. And it's our tax, and then we've got the last 2 columns are star. Well, you look at this and you see, well, gosh, back in, it's a little hard for me to read, back in 2005, of the African American students, only 48% of them were passing all tests. Yes, and 52% of them were not. If you look back in 2005, roughly 52% of Hispanic children were passing all tests, 48% were not. And if you look at the Anglo population, approximately 72% were passing, 28% were not. Well, that doesn't look very good. No, it doesn't. And then they spend $90 million a year to Pearson or more to get the new and improved STAR test with our tougher standards. And now the African American children are back below 50%. The Hispanics are hovering around 50%, and the Anglo children are still about 70%. And this gap, this achievement gap, has persisted for over a decade. Well, who's responsible to fix this? The legislature. And this is in their own book. So what they're seeing is what I'm seeing, and it doesn't make a difference. I can take a different graph using economically disadvantaged children who suffer the ravages of poverty, and I can compare them to non-economically disadvantaged children, and I will see a gap similar to this. I can take ELL children who are acquiring, and I can compare them to native speakers, and we'll see an achievement gap similar to this. I can take the SAT, ACT results, and I will see an achievement gap similar to this. Okay, so what? Well, how do you argue that you're providing a general diffusion of knowledge, that all students have an equal access when it looks like this? And the answer is, I don't know. So, as we draw toward the end of this, I was thinking, in 24 years that I served as a judge, we were called upon many times to deal with children, both as a juvenile judge that I served for 6 years as doing family law cases, and the legislature writes in the Texas Family Code, "Dear Judge, whenever you make these decisions concerning conservatorship, visitation, whether you should remove children from their homes, whether you should let one parent relocate cross-country, whether or not you should award joint custody or whether or not you should restrict custody. You should at all times keep the best interest of the children in mind. And my closing statement is this: I think it's about time that the legislature take its own advice and take the best interest of the children at heart and start doing something. They say, well, we want to wait to see what the Supreme Court does. What? Even if I'm wrong, even if I improvidently found this to be unconstitutional, what do they say about the stuff that's in their own materials? We are dooming a generation of these children by providing an insufficient education. And we can do better. It's in our best interest to do better. So, good luck tomorrow. Go hit a home run. Knock 'em dead. Thank y'all very much.